And now to the No Kings protests. Millions of Americans from New York to Georgia to Texas and California and many other states and cities in between taking to the streets to protest the Trump administration's policies. It may be the largest one-day protest in the U.S. in more than 50 years. Here's ABC's Andrew Dimbert.
Tonight, President Trump mocking the millions of Americans who took to the streets in peaceful protest on Saturday in what has been described as one of the largest single-day demonstrations in U.S. history. An estimated 7 million people gathered across some 2,700 No Kings rallies in cities from coast to coast, according to organizers. Trump responding via social media, posting an AI-generated video depicting a crowned Trump flying a King Trump jet, and sharing another video, first posted by Vice President J.D. Vance, showing Trump placing a crown on his head.
Okay, so imagine you're Donald Trump. You're sitting president. You've used executive power aggressively. You've imposed massive tariffs, claiming emergency authority. You've pushed the boundaries of presidential power further than anyone in modern history. And you've counted on the Supreme Court to back you up. After all, you appointed 3 of the justices. You've got a conservative supermajority, and they've ruled in your favor before. But then you go before the court to defend your tariff powers. And instead of deferring to presidential authority, instead of accepting your legal arguments, the justices tear into you. The Chief Justice calls out your team for courtroom lies and contradictions. Other justices openly express skepticism about your interpretation of emergency powers. They question whether you're manufacturing crises to bypass Congress. They challenge your entire legal theory. And you can't control them, can't threaten them, can't fire them, can only sit there or watch from outside the courtroom as the Supreme Court publicly rebukes you. And you're furious, because this isn't how it's supposed to work. These are supposed to be your judges, your appointments, your allies, and instead they're becoming your adversaries. And that fury, that sense of betrayal, is leading to social media rants, to threats, to promises that you'll use the Justice Department to punish judges after you leave office. And everyone can see it, can see you unraveling, can see the Supreme Court standing up to you, and can see that your grip on power isn't as absolute as you thought. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
But from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York's Times Square, a common refrain. What brings you out here today?
Democracy is dying and we have to save it.
Mary, this was the second No Kings Day since President Trump returned to the White House, and many protesters on the ground we spoke to say they hope to carry this momentum into the midterm elections, now just a little over a year away. Mary?
Andrew, thank you.
The case centers on Trump's tariff powers. His claim that the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act gives him virtually unlimited authority to impose tariffs whenever he declares an emergency, and Trump has used this claimed authority extensively, has imposed sweeping tariffs on dozens of countries, has claimed trade imbalances constitute emergencies, has argued that protecting American industry justifies unilateral executive action, and lower courts have been skeptical, have questioned whether IEEPA really gives presidents that much power, have suggested Trump is stretching the law beyond its intended meaning. But Trump appealed, took the case to the Supreme Court, and expected to win, expected his appointed justices to side with broad presidential authority, expected conservative judges to defer to executive power. But that's not what's happening. Instead, the justices are asking hard questions, are challenging the government's legal theories, are expressing skepticism about whether IEPA allows what Trump is claiming. Chief Justice Roberts led the questioning, and according to reports, he was pointed, was direct, called out contradictions in the government's arguments, noted that Trump's legal team had made statements that contradicted evidence, that there were courtroom lies about what the law says and what Trump's actual authority is, and that public calling out, that direct rebuke from the Chief Justice, that's extraordinary. Roberts is typically measured, typically diplomatic, typically avoids public confrontation, but apparently Trump's arguments were so problematic, Trump's team's representation so questionable, that Roberts felt compelled to call it out, to say publicly that what the government was arguing didn't match reality, and that rebuke, coming from the Chief Justice, coming from a conservative judge that Trump might have expected support from, that's devastating. That's a signal that even Trump's appointed justices have limits, have lines they won't cross, have respect for law and precedent that exceeds loyalty to the president who appointed them. Other justices joined the skepticism. Barrett, Gorsuch, even others asked probing questions. Questioned whether emergencies were real or manufactured. Question whether Trump's interpretation of IEEPA was correct. Question whether allowing this much presidential power would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance. And their questions weren't friendly, weren't softballs designed to let the government make its best case, were challenges, were expressions of doubt, were signals that the court isn't buying Trump's arguments. And legal analysts watching the oral arguments came away thinking Trump is going to lose, that the court is going to rule against him, that his tariff authority is going to be curtailed. And if that happens, if the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, that's a massive legal and political defeat, invalidates Trump's signature economic policy, establishes that presidents can't claim emergency powers to bypass Congress, sets precedent that constrains executive authority, and embarrasses Trump by showing his appointed justices won't rubber stamp his agenda. Trump's reaction has been predictably aggressive. He's taken to social media, called the justices biased, called them partisan, attacked them for daring to question him, and made threats. Said that when he leaves office, when he's no longer president, he'll use allies in government to punish judges who ruled against him. Said he'll have the Justice Department investigate them. Said there will be consequences, and those threats are dangerous. Our attacks on judicial independence, our attempts to intimidate judges into ruling favorably. But they're also signs of weakness, signs that Trump is cornered, that he sees the writing on the wall, that he knows he's losing and is lashing out, because strong leaders don't threaten judges, don't attack the judiciary for doing its job, don't promise retribution for unfavorable rulings. Weak leaders do that. Leaders who are losing do that. And Trump is losing, is watching the Supreme Court reject his claims, is realizing that even his appointed justices won't protect him when his legal arguments are weak. The broader pattern of Trump's court losses makes this moment more significant, because this isn't just one case. Trump has been losing in court repeatedly, has had policies struck down, has had emergency declarations rejected, has had claims of executive authority rebuffed, and the cumulative effect is a president who's being constrained by courts, who's discovering that judicial branch is still independent, still willing to check executive power, still capable of saying no, even to a president who thinks he should be able to do whatever he wants. And that constraint, that judicial pushback, is one of the few things still checking Trump's power, still preventing him from acting with complete impunity. And the Supreme Court's rebuke reinforces that, shows that even the highest court, even with conservative majority, even with Trump appointees, there are limits, there are lines, and Trump has crossed them. So buckle up, because we're about to break down exactly what the Supreme Court said and why Trump's fury reveals just how cornered he's becoming. All right, let's dig into what actually happened during these Supreme Court proceedings, because the specifics of what the justices said matter, the legal arguments matter, and understanding why Trump's team got rebuked so publicly, that tells us something about how weak his legal position really is. So we start with the IEEPA claim. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was passed in 1977. It gives the president authority to regulate international economic transactions during national emergencies. And the law has been used. Presidents have declared emergencies and imposed sanctions, have frozen assets, have restricted transactions with hostile nations. But those uses have been targeted, have been responses to genuine crises, wars, terrorism, human rights abuses, specific threats that required immediate presidential action. Trump is trying to stretch IEEPA much further. It's claiming that trade imbalances constitute emergencies, that protecting domestic industry justifies invoking IEEPA, that he can impose massive tariffs on dozens of countries based on economic conditions that aren't really emergencies in any traditional sense. The Supreme Court justices are questioning whether that's what Congress intended, whether IEEPA was designed to give presidents that much power, and based on oral argument reports, they're skeptical. Roberts asked pointed questions about what constitutes an emergency, about whether trade deficits, which have existed for decades, can suddenly be declared emergencies just because a president wants tariff authority, about whether accepting Trump's interpretation would effectively give presidents unlimited power to bypass Congress on trade policy. And those questions suggest Roberts sees problems with Trump's argument, sees that it stretches the law too far, sees that it would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance of power. And Barrett and Gorsuch, both Trump appointees, asked similar questions, expressed similar skepticism, suggested that maybe Trump is claiming more authority than IEEPA actually grants, and that skepticism from Trump's own appointees, that's what has to be devastating for him. Because if even justices he put on the court don't buy his arguments, if even conservative judges think he's overreaching, then his legal position is indefensible. Chief Justice Roberts calling out courtroom lies is particularly significant, because that's not language the Chief Justice uses lightly, doesn't casually accuse lawyers of lying. But apparently Trump's legal team made representations that contradict the evidence, made claims about what the law says that weren't accurate, made arguments that didn't square with the statutory text or legislative history. And Roberts called it out, said publicly that what the government was arguing wasn't true. And that's a devastating critique because it attacks the credibility of Trump's entire legal team, makes future arguments from them less believable, makes judges more skeptical of every claim they make, and suggests that Trump's defense strategy involves deliberate misrepresentation, involves hoping judges won't check the actual law, won't verify claims, will just accept government arguments at face value. But the Supreme Court isn't doing that, it's checking the facts. It's verifying the law, it's calling out misrepresentations, and that thorough scrutiny is exposing how weak Trump's case really is. The contradiction issue is revealing because apparently Trump's team has taken different positions in different cases, has argued one thing in lower courts and another thing at the Supreme Court, has made representations that conflict with each other, and justices noticed, pointed out the contradictions, asked which version is true, asked how both positions can be simultaneously valid, and Trump's lawyers apparently didn't have good answers, couldn't reconcile the contradictions, couldn't explain why their arguments keep changing, and that inconsistency suggests the legal theory isn't solid, isn't based on genuine legal principles, but rather on finding whatever argument might work in whatever forum, and that opportunistic approach doesn't fly at the Supreme Court, doesn't convince justices who are looking for principled legal analysis, who want consistent interpretation of law, who see through tactical argumentation designed to win rather than to illuminate truth. The emergency power question is fundamental because IEEPA requires actual emergencies, requires genuine crises that demand immediate presidential action, and Trump's tariffs aren't responding to emergencies in that sense. Trade imbalances aren't sudden crises, aren't threats that require immediate unilateral action, are long-term economic conditions that should be addressed through normal legislative processes, through Congress debating and passing trade legislation, and justices are asking whether calling trade imbalances emergencies stretches the concept of emergency beyond recognition, whether it makes the emergency exception swallow the rule, whether it effectively gives presidents power to declare anything an emergency and bypass Congress, and those concerns are legitimate, are about preserving constitutional structure, are about ensuring presidents don't claim unlimited authority by manufacturing crises, and Trump's tariffs seem like exactly that, like manufactured crises designed to justify power grabs, and the court is pushing back. Trump's social media threats against judges are creating their own problems because judicial independence is fundamental. Judges have to be able to rule based on law without fear of retaliation, and Trump threatening to use government power to punish judges who rule against him, that's an attack on that independence. That's attempting to intimidate, and it probably won't work, probably will make judges more determined to rule against him because judges don't like being threatened, don't respond well to attempts at intimidation, and are likely to see Trump's threats as confirmation that he shouldn't be trusted with expanded power, that he's exactly the kind of president who needs to be constrained by courts. So Trump's threats are counterproductive, are making judges less sympathetic, are strengthening the case against him. The pattern of losses matters for context. This Supreme Court rebuke isn't isolated. Trump has been losing in courts repeatedly, has had major policies struck down, has had claims of authority rejected, has seen courts across the country rule against him, and that pattern affects how the Supreme Court views his arguments, makes them skeptical from the start, makes them think maybe Trump's legal theories are consistently weak, consistently involve overreach, consistently deserve rejection, and that bias, that prior context of losses, it makes Trump's job harder, makes persuading the court more difficult, because he's not starting from neutral, he's starting from we've seen this before, and it didn't work then either. The separation of powers implications are what really concern the justices, because if Trump's interpretation of IEPA is accepted, if presidents can declare trade imbalances, emergencies, and impose whatever tariffs they want, then Congress's constitutional role in regulating commerce is undermined. The Constitution gives Congress power to regulate trade, gives Congress authority over tariffs, and while Congress can delegate some authority to presidents, there are limits. Can't delegate so much that Congress effectively gives away its constitutional power, and Trump's interpretation of IEPA comes dangerously close to that, comes close to saying Congress has given away its trade authority, and justices are concerned about that, are worried about preserving constitutional structure, about ensuring each branch retains its core functions, and that concern is leading to skepticism about Trump's arguments, leading to questions about whether accepting his position will fundamentally damage the constitutional order. The practical effects of striking down the tariffs are significant. If the court rules against Trump, billions of dollars in tariffs get refunded, trade relationships normalize, America's relationship with trading partners improves. But Trump's signature economic policy is invalidated. His claims of bringing back American jobs through tariffs are undermined. His entire economic narrative is challenged. And politically, that's devastating. That's Trump losing on the issue he campaigned on, losing on the policy he claimed would fix America's economy, and having to admit the policy was illegal, was an overreach, was beyond presidential authority, and that admission hurts Trump politically, costs him support, makes voters question his judgment, makes his claims of business genius ring hollow. So let's break down what this Supreme Court rebuke means, why it's so significant that Trump is being publicly criticized by justices he appointed, what the implications are for presidential power, for Trump's agenda, for American democracy, because this is about more than just tariffs. This is about whether presidents can manufacture emergencies to claim unlimited power, whether courts will stand up to executive overreach, whether constitutional structure still constrains presidents who want to act unilaterally. First, the immediate legal impact. Trump is likely going to lose this case. The oral argument suggests the court is skeptical of his position, suggests they're going to rule that EPA doesn't give him the authority he claims, and that ruling will strike down his tariffs, will invalidate billions of dollars in trade policy, will require refunds, will normalize trade relationships, and will establish precedent that limits future presidents. That says emergency powers can't be stretched to cover non-emergencies. That says Congress's role in trade policy can't be completely bypassed. And that precedent is important. It's constitutional protection against presidential overreach. Second, the political damage to Trump being publicly rebuked by the Supreme Court is embarrassing, especially when the rebuke comes from justices he appointed, from a Chief Justice who's conservative, from judges who should theoretically be sympathetic to his agenda. And that rebuke shows Trump's legal arguments are weak, shows even friendly judges don't buy them, shows Trump is claiming authority he doesn't have. And that perception hurts politically, makes voters question Trump's competence, makes his claims of being a successful dealmaker ring hollow, makes his economic policies seem illegitimate, and costs him support, particularly among moderates and independents who care about constitutional norms, who don't like presidents who overreach, who value checks and balances. Third, judicial independence prevailing. Trump has tried to influence courts, has appointed loyalists, has threatened judges, has attacked judicial decisions publicly, all attempting to make courts defer to him, to make judges afraid to rule against him. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. Seemed like Trump's appointed judges would rubber stamp his agenda, but this Supreme Court rebuke shows that's not happening, shows judicial independence still exists, shows judges, even Trump-appointed ones, rule based on law rather than loyalty, and that's crucial for democracy, for rule of law, for ensuring no president is above the law. So this rebuke is courts doing their job, checking executive power, saying no to overreach, and that should be celebrated regardless of political affiliation. Fourth, the precedent for future cases. This Supreme Court skepticism toward Trump's emergency powers, it applies to other cases too, to other claims of executive authority, to other attempts to bypass Congress. And Trump has made many such attempts, has declared emergencies for border walls, has claimed authority over immigration, has tried to govern through executive order. In courts reviewing those actions, they're going to cite this case, going to say the Supreme Court already rejected Trump's expansive view of presidential power, going to use this precedent to strike down other overreaches. So this one case has ripple effects, affects Trump's entire governing strategy, makes all his claims of unilateral authority more vulnerable, makes judicial pushback more likely across the board. Fifth, Trump's threats backfiring. By threatening judges on social media, by promising retribution, Trump is making enemies of the judiciary, is giving judges reason to distrust him, to see him as dangerous, to think he needs to be constrained, and that's affecting their rulings, is making them more willing to rule against him, more skeptical of his arguments, more protective of their independence. So Trump's attempts at intimidation are achieving the opposite of what he wants, are strengthening judicial resistance rather than creating judicial deference, are making judges determined to stand up to him rather than afraid to oppose him. And that dynamic, that adversarial relationship between Trump and courts is going to define his presidency, going to result in ongoing legal battles, going to constrain his ability to govern. 6. What this means for separation of powers. The Constitution divides power among 3 branches, gives each branch specific authorities, and requires cooperation and compromise for government to function. Trump has tried to concentrate power, has tried to claim that presidents can act unilaterally, can bypass Congress, can ignore courts, and this Supreme Court rebuke is a rejection of that. Is the judiciary saying no, the Constitution doesn't work that way. You can't claim unlimited power. You have to respect congressional authority, have to accept judicial review, have to work within constitutional structure. And that reaffirmation of separation of powers, that reminder that presidents have limits, that's vital. That's courts protecting constitutional order. That's ensuring democracy survives Trump's assault on norms. 7. The conservative majority question. Trump expected his appointed justices to support him, expected a conservative majority to defer to presidential power, and some conservatives do favor strong executives, do believe in expansive presidential authority, But apparently even conservative justices have limits. Even they think Trump has gone too far. Even they're not willing to rubber stamp every claim of executive power. And that's important. That's evidence that judicial philosophy isn't just about partisan outcomes, that conservative judges have principles that sometimes constrain Republican presidents, that legal analysis matters more than political loyalty, and preserving that judicial integrity, that principled decision-making, that's crucial for rule of law, for ensuring courts remain legitimate, for preventing complete partisan capture of judiciary. 8. What happens if Trump loses? When the court rules against him, Trump has to comply, has to rescind the tariffs, has to refund money collected, has to admit his policy was illegal, and that's going to enrage him, going to lead to more attacks on courts, more threats, more claims that he's being persecuted. But he has to comply anyway, because courts can enforce their rulings, can hold presidents in contempt, can order government officials to act. And if Trump refuses, if he tries to defy the Supreme Court, that's a constitutional crisis. That's grounds for impeachment. That's conduct so serious that even some Republicans might turn on him. So Trump probably complies, probably backs down, but does so while attacking courts viciously, while undermining public confidence in judiciary, while laying groundwork for future attacks on judicial independence. 9th, the 2026 implications. Trump's court losses, his Supreme Court rebukes, his visible fury and threats, all of that is campaign material. Democrats are going to run ads showing Trump being rejected by courts, showing his policies being struck down, showing his claims of authority being rebuffed, and going to argue Trump is lawless, is dangerous, is willing to destroy constitutional order to maintain power. And those arguments are going to resonate, going to convince swing voters, going to motivate Democrats, and going to cost Republican seats, going to make 2026 harder for GOP, going to contribute to potential Democratic wave. So Trump's legal problems become electoral problems, become reasons voters reject Republicans. 10th, the bottom line. The Supreme Court publicly rebuking Trump is significant. Shows even conservative justices think he's overreached. Shows judicial independence still functions. Shows courts will check presidential power even when president appoints judges. Establishes precedent limiting emergency powers. Protects separation of powers. And enrages Trump, leading to threats and attacks that further undermine his position. This is courts doing their job, saying no to executive overreach, protecting constitutional order, and Trump can't stop it, can't intimidate judges, can't claim unlimited authority, has to accept that courts constrain presidents. That law applies even to him, and that acceptance, that constraint, that's democracy working, that's rule of law prevailing. We'll keep covering every development, every court decision, every Trump attack on judiciary, every indication of how this legal battle shapes his presidency. Because this is one of the most important stories of this era, whether courts can check authoritarian impulses, whether presidents respect limits, whether democracy survives. Stay tuned.